Memories of the Northeast from Northsound2.
In the mid-50s, along with three friends, started a jazz club, and that was very successful up until the early 60s, when we ceased operating really because of evening classes. It wasn't because of the competition from beat groups, as many people thought. But during the course of running the jazz club, I met, in rather amusing circumstances, a gentleman from Elgin called Albert Bonici, who sadly is now dead. Died about 3 years ago. Anyhow, the reason for that was he had decided to run a jazz festival in Elgin, and I wrote him a rather abrupt letter saying that I was the jazz person in the Northeast, and what did he mean by doing this? However, his tactics were excellent. He invited me to dinner at the Station Hotel and managed to make me change my mind. In the early 60s, he and I started doing tours with various people like the Carl Denver Trio and the Springfields. That was where Dusty Springfield actually started, along with her brother and another. They were a trio. And then, of course, later Dusty worked for me and did tours for me and Albert as a solo artist, but that was the first meeting with Dusty. And of course, that was the time of the Bachelors and so on. Then, in the early 60s, 62 I think it was, Albert booked this band from Liverpool called the Beatles, from Brian Epstein. And they came, I think the first tour was really a bit of a disaster because they were to play Keith and they couldn't make it for snow. And basically, they returned to Liverpool, and I'm sure would hope never to see Scotland again. However, a month or so later, a few months later, they came back, and this was the first time that I saw them personally. And that we ran a dance at the Museum Hall, Bridge of Allen, and that was the first time I ever saw the Beatles. And I would always tell this story against myself. People love it and quote it. That I was standing there with Andy Lothian, who is still alive and running I think it's an insurance broker's firm in Dundee. And Andy said, you know, Gordon, these guys are tipped for really the top. I shook my head and said, don't think so, Andy, they're too loud. I hadn't heard of things like 5 kilowatts per channel just at a local dance in these days. Anyhow, at that time they were dressed in leather suits, and they had long hair by our standards. But when I say long, it certainly wasn't more than to their collars. It really nowadays it wouldn't cause comment at all. But they did Aberdeen, and again, contrary to rumour, you'll meet people who say that they were booed off stage at the Beach Ballroom in Aberdeen. Completely untrue. And you'll also hear about stories about hundreds screaming for their autographs. Again, untrue. They got applause, and there was about 20 girls, or there were about 20 girls at the dressing room door when the show finished. But those 20 were there every week. But 9 months later, I think, I would need to look my diaries before we had them again, but by this time they were big time. But Albert had written a return clause into the contract, which meant that if they played in Scotland, they had to play for us. And it was Glasgow, Edinburgh, and the Caird Hall, Dundee. And on that occasion, they really were stars. And in Glasgow, unfortunately, the hall that we were going to use, I think it got burnt down, the St Andrews Hall, and we were in a converted cinema in no man's land and surrounded by mud and whatnot. It was unbelievable, and it was pouring, I remember, and there were buckets in the passageways to collect the water. And when the Beatles went on stage, we usually had more than one band in these days, and they were, of course, the top of the bill. And it wasn't a dance now we're talking about; it was suited for a concert. And when they got to halfway through the show, a little more perhaps, and they were doing, say, Twist and Shout or something like that, the youngsters at the concert were nearly all on their feet and jumping up and down. And the balcony was a cantilever balcony, and it was actually beginning to move. And you could see it in the plaster on the underside of it was cracking. Now, there's a fairly senior police officer there, and he said to me, I was standing in the wings, he came to me and he said, you'll have to stop this. He said, do you see what's happening to the balcony? I said, I see what's happening to the balcony, but how do you suggest I stop it? So I think he stood sort of biting his lip until the show finished, and mercifully there were no big cascades of plaster onto those below, and everything was all right. Nobody was hurt in any way. But the last tour that we did with the Beatles, where they did insist on a television set in the dressing room. The Rolling Stones. Now, on the first occasion that we had the Rolling Stones, we had them finishing, as far as I remember, they were finishing the first half of a concert. They were not top of the bill. And at that stage, they never had a #1 record. But by a stroke of good fortune, when we actually had them on tour, they had a #1 record. And they're the one that I spoke to most often, because it was always the one that really was coming to me that I spoke to of these groups. The one that would come out and speak to me was Mick Jagger, and I liked Mick very much. And I think that Mick, to me, had more talent than some of the other people. Without naming them, I think he was a very talented, or is, I should say, of course, Mick is a very talented person. I think the first time he played in Aberdeen would have been in the Mitchell Hall, which is part of Marshall College. And he was part of it was Long John Baldry, Julie Driscoll and Rod Stewart with Graham Bond's Steam Packet. That was the first time so he did the Mitchell Hall, and there were another couple of venues, but one was, at that time, the University Charities Campaign ran a thing called the Cabaret Cafe, and usually they found a large empty shop to run this in. And as far as I remember, he did one of those. It was an old bookshop that was in Broad Street. That was a very big thing in the northeast here until typhoid came along. But that was nearly all what we call local or semi-local bands. The exceptions being, funnily enough, Irish show bands came over and did some of the marquee dances. It was mainly, for me, they booked either Scottish country dance bands or local pop bands, and there were quite a few local pop bands, you know, the Royal Teens and the Strollers and so on, and they were quite good. They weren't bad at all. And basically on Friday and Saturday nights they'd usually have maybe a Scottish country dance band on the Friday, and then a pop band on the Saturday, pop cover band on the Saturday. But it was usually in conjunction with one of the something like the old Meldrum Show, or one of these sort of things. But there were quite a lot of them. But then what really put an end to that, when typhoid came, that put an end to it, because the police would not allow, quite rightly, them to run the marquee dances, because most of these marquee dances were licensed, and there was no washing facilities for glasses. That time you didn't have the plastic cups and so on, cardboard cups, and therefore the glasses were simply rinsed out in a big zinc bath below the counter. And I mean, it clearly was unhygienic, and up until then nobody had suffered at all from it, but with typhoid it was no longer it was no longer acceptable. And really the marquee dances never fully recovered.
Memories of the Northeast from Northsound2.